I'm thinking about our lesson today, I'm reminded that every single generation, I guess, every whether that be in a family, whether that be in a country, whether that be in whatever context it is, every single generation deals with the challenges of faith and how faith is questioned in certain ways, and how society deals with that faith, and how that Christians have to deal with how society deals with it. And I think it's because basically Satan hasn't given up. He hasn't stopped trying to take people from God. He has not done that. And so any answer that one generation comes up with that helps, any answer that we as individuals develop in order to somehow make our faith strong and to understand how our faith works is often challenged. And so how I have thought about my faith and how I have worked through my faith has happened in a certain context. That doesn't mean that challenges don't come to that. That doesn't mean that there aren't challenges that are brought to it. And I think that it is interesting because as I see some of the questions that are being asked of our younger people, I see that really it's kind of like same song, second verse, a little bit different, a little bit different spin on it in order to make it difficult for that generation to deal with the issues that we have dealt with in the past or that we have settled in our minds. And I think that it is also interesting because some of those issues come up and they also challenge us on several levels. And I'll give you two examples. And it does tie into what we're talking about today. So I recently saw a challenge to the idea of hate the sin and love the sinner. And the idea was that right there somehow is demeaning, or that it is somehow derogatory toward the person who is going through the sin or whatever else. But my understanding of what Scripture says is I see a Jesus, I see a God who passionately loves every single individual, but abhors sin, cannot stand it. And of course, the classic example is a woman caught in the act of adultery. We know that story from John chapter 8. And Jesus, he does not condemn the woman. Neither does anybody in the crowd, because Jesus had basically called them all out and said, "You're all sinners." And the only one who had any kind of right to condemn the woman was Jesus himself. But he doesn't allow her to go on with her life of sin. He says, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and leave your life of sin." And so the idea somehow that the sin and the person are so intertwined that we can't love the one and hate the other is one that is foreign to me. And so we've got to understand that we can't actually love the person passionately and hope for their salvation and strive for that, while at the same time hating the sin that is in their lives, whatever that sin might be, even in our own lives. As we come to understand God's grace, we can understand that there's sin in our lives. To hate that. We can see Paul doing that in Romans, talking about how wretched he is in doing the very things that he doesn't want to do, and the things that he should do, he's not doing. He goes through all that. We can understand that. We can sense that. But I think also in the sense of justice, that sometimes we have now come to the point where the idea of how justice is working out and how God works through the world situation to make justice happen sometimes is very unsatisfying to the world. And really, it's been unsatisfying for a long time. Because ultimately, what we find in the Bible is a situation in which justice sometimes is delayed until after we're dead. That's just the reality of the situation. We are not granted the guarantee that in this life, in this world, that we will experience justice through political systems, through any kind of power hierarchy or anything like that. We are not guaranteed that. Although we would love that and we would hope for that. And yet, justice is sometimes delayed. And it is far beyond what people should reasonably expect to endure, except that God is faithful. Vengeance is his. He will repay. He will vindicate the righteous and give them justice. We see in Revelation, under the altar, the souls of the martyred underneath the throne of God, and they cry out to God, "How long? How long, Lord?" And he says, "Just a little while longer, until your brothers and sisters are slaughtered." So we got to understand this. This right here is something that is abhorrent and has been abhorrent to the world for a long, long, long time. The entire Renaissance was built on the concept of humanism, that we're not just necessarily looking forward into the future for something that we get after we die, but we deserve to have something now that we can hold on to now. And we can understand how there were several people throughout history who have said people have used the idea of God's justice in the future as a method for suppressing people in the present. So kings and princes and governments and all this kind of stuff can say, well, guess what? You've got a lousy life right now and you're living in your dirt floor hut and there's nothing that you can do about it, but God will reward you if you're faithful and you listen to the king. That's what Karl Marx talked about when he said that religion is the opiate of the people. It gives them a hope for something in the future and allows them to live in squalor and misery for their entire lives. We understand that that is not right. We understand that that is not just. We understand that that is not the way that it should be in any kind of context. And any system that allows that to happen is unjust. But we are not promised justice necessarily in this life. And so I would like for us to talk a little bit about justice and God and his justice, because as I take a look at the situation that we find ourselves in, we've been dealing with this COVID-19 situation, and we've been dealing with all of that, and we dealt with that until about Memorial Day, and then there was this entire upsurge in how society took a look at how the African American community has been treated in this country, and we can talk about all sorts of injustice that has happened. And as I am scrolling down my Facebook pages or whatever else, injustice after injustice after injustice is the order of the day. Whether we're talking about children that have been abused, or whether we're talking about the African American community, or whether we're talking about child laborers in some foreign country or whatever else, there has been this outpouring, there has been this understanding that things aren't right, things are not just. And so how in the world are we supposed to handle these situations when they come out? How are we supposed to understand this? And I want us to understand that God is a just God. Amos, I love the passage in Amos 5:24. Let justice roll down like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream. The hope is that it comes. The hope is that it is. But when we take a look at what God does, and when we take a look at how he is, we find that he works in justice and righteousness. We're going to look at particularly Isaiah 58 today. We're going to be in different places. But as I was taking a look at Isaiah 58, I saw some things that were certainly true here, that we can hang our hats on, that we can understand that God works in righteousness and justice. And in the book of Isaiah already, the corruption of Israel and the corruption of Judah are part of parcel of what is going on in that time and in that world. And we see in Isaiah 58, God basically talking to his people and saying, goodness, you guys are not acting in the way that you should be acting. You're not doing what you should be doing. And so we see that we have this entire section, and it says, shout it aloud, do not hold back, raise your voice like a trumpet, declare to my people their rebellion, and to the house of Jacob their sins. For day after day they seek me out, and they seem eager to know my ways. Well, that sounds great. They're eager to know God's ways, but the kicker is they seem eager, isn't it? They seem eager to know my ways. As if they were a nation that does what is right. and has not forsaken the commands of its God. They ask me for just decisions. They seem eager for God to come near them. Why have we fasted, they say, and you have not seen it? Why have we humbled ourselves, and you have not noticed? Yet on the day of your fasting, you do as you please and exploit all your workers. Your fasting ends in quarreling and strife, and in striking each other with wicked fists. And you take a look at all of what is going on here, and you're seeing what God is looking at in Israel, and he is saying, I am a God of justice. And you're asking for my mercy, and you're asking for my justice, but you really don't want it. Because right now I am acting justly, and I am acting in righteousness. I am doing the right thing, and what I am doing at this particular time is I'm holding back my mercy and my grace because you have abandoned me. You are coming to me in a seeming way. And you're acting in a way that is completely contrary to how you are talking. And I am not going to have anything like that. He talks about an awful lot of things that we're going to talk about a little bit later, but I want us to go down to verse 8, because he talks about doing the right things, and it says in verse 8, if you do these things, then your light will break forth like the dawn, and your healing will quickly appear. Then your righteous one will go before you, and the glory of the Lord will be your rear guard. As we take a look at this, what we see is that God is wanting to act in justice, and he's wanting to act in righteousness. This is how he acts. This is what he does. And if he is withholding justice and righteousness from those oppressors, it is part of his justice, and it is part of his righteousness. He cannot act in ways that are contrary to his nature. And he is going to act rightly. He is going to do right things. He's going to act in justice. It's going to be that way. I love the New Testament passage in Romans chapter 3. And what we have there is a situation in which Paul is talking about how God acts and what he does. And I'd like to read a few verses there if I can get there. I'm in Romans. And it talks about verse 21, and in verse 21 about God's righteousness. And the thing I want us to understand about this as we take a look at this is that God has declared that there is absolutely no one who is righteous. There is no one who is just. There is no one who does all these things. And so, really, we all stand in a condemned situation before God. And yet God, in his justice and his righteousness, does this in verse 21. But now, a righteousness from God apart from the law has been made known, to which the law and the prophets testify. This righteousness from God comes through faith in Jesus Christ. To all who believe, there is no difference, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and are justified freely by his grace through the redemption that came by Jesus Christ. And let's get this straight here. God presented him as a sacrifice of atonement through faith in his blood. He did this to demonstrate his justice, because in his forbearance he had left the sins committed beforehand unpunished. He did it to demonstrate his justice at the present time, so as to be just, and the one who justifies the man who has faith in Jesus. What we have here at this particular point in time is, before Jesus came, there was no justification for sin. There was no making holy. There was no righteousness within us. We could not do it ourselves. And so God, in his forbearance, said, I've got to make this right. I've got to make this just. I've got to make this possible. And so he sent Jesus Christ to be the sacrifice. And he acts in justice and righteousness. But what we also find is that when he acts, the context is always in terms of those who have need. If we go back to Isaiah 58, we see some things that are going on that are not right. And as we take a look at this, we see what is going on. In verse 6, God says, is not this the kind of fasting I have chosen? To loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and to break every yoke. Is it not to share your food with the hungry and to provide the poor wanderer with shelter? When you see the naked, to clothe them and not to turn away from your own flesh and blood. And then in verse 9, in the second part of that, it says, if you do away with the yoke of oppression, with the pointing finger and malicious talk, and if you spend yourselves on behalf of the hungry and satisfy the needs of the oppressed, then your light will rise in the darkness, and your night will become like the noonday. And the Lord will guide you always. And so we see that this is something that is going on in this particular context, is that those people who are in need are the ones who are in need of this righteousness and this justice. It is justice to take care of those who are in need. It is the right thing to do. We must do it. That is what God is expecting. That is how He is expecting us to act. In Matthew 25, 34 through 36, we see this is the parable of those who were separated, the sheep and the goats. And the sheep are on the right side and the goats are on the left side. And I always feel funny standing up here going the right side and the left side. Guess what? We have a lot more on the left than the right. Eesh. And we also have one clown who's saying, what's going on? That's all right. But what we see here is what is the context under which people are judged. And what we find in this, that those people who are judged to be faithful, it says the righteous will answer him, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you? The king will reply, I tell you the truth, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers of mine, you did it for me. Justice and righteousness. James 1:27, religion that God our Father accepts in pure and faultless as this, to keep oneself from being polluted by the world, and to look after the widow and orphan in their distress. This is in the context of those in need. It is in the context of those who need redress. It's in the context of those who are the most helpless in society to help themselves. It needs to be done. But we also see that when God acts, every word and action creates, maintains, and preserves community. We see this in a very, very important way. That what God is doing is He is making sure that community is established and that it is preserved. Really, the entire reason why God gave the law was to create and preserve community. That is, and I want us to understand this. We can take a look at the law of God, and we can take a look at any of that, and we can say, well, yeah, okay, these were the terms under which they were supposed to live, and it's a good moral code, and it's a good legal code, and we can look at it all that way. But what it really, really, really is at its heart and its core, it is that which creates and maintains community. It is the basis for community. It is a basis for relationship. It is a basis for any kind of fellowship whatsoever. One person has said, we take a look at the law and we can see in the Old Testament how it's eye for eye and tooth for tooth. And we can say, wow, that sounds pretty harsh. Do we understand really what the mercy in that was? The mercy in that was that only one eye for one eye, and only one tooth for one tooth. You do not mete out the full vengeance of your anger on anyone who has wronged you, but rather you act with reserve. You're not taking the life for an eye. You're not doing that. Do we understand that? Do we understand how revolutionary that is? And when Jesus says, you have heard that it was said long ago, eye for eye or tooth for tooth, but I tell you, don't be angry with your brother. What he really is, he is fulfilling the law, isn't he? That's what he's doing. I kind of got off on a tangent, but I just felt like it. You'll have to forgive me. I think you'll give me that. But what we see is that every word and action creates, maintains, and preserves community. In Judges 5, Deborah talks about how God has justly and righteously done right by the people of Israel. They were being oppressed. And she sings a song. And she says God has acted justly and righteously, and he has maintained us. He has made it possible for us to live. In Psalm chapter 50, we see this. And in Psalm chapter 50, it says, the mighty one, God, the Lord, speaks. He summons the earth from the rising of the sun to the place where it sets. From Zion, perfect in beauty, God shines forth. Our God comes forth and will not be silent. A fire devours before him, and around him a tempest rages. He summons the heavens above and the earth, that he may judge his people. Gather to me my consecrated ones, who made a covenant with me by sacrifice, and the heavens proclaim his righteousness, for God himself is judge. And we see that it is in the context of community, we see that it is in the context of preserving that community that these things are said. 1 Corinthians 11, 17 through 33. Last week, Willie talked about discerning the body and what that means. And as we take a look at that particular passage, we know that it is in the context of the Lord's Supper. But there are things that Paul says, I have no praise for you in, because your meetings do more harm than good. In the first place, I hear that when you come together as a church, there are divisions among you, and to some extent I believe it. When you come together, it is not the Lord's Supper you eat, for as you eat, each of you goes ahead without waiting for anybody else. One remains hungry, another gets drunk. Don't you have homes to eat and drink in? Or do you despise the church of God and humiliate those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you for this? Certainly not. Do we understand that it is in the context of maintaining and preserving community? Under the new covenant, justice and righteousness is preserved by doing this. When we come together as the Lord's body and we take the Lord's Supper, what we do is we think about one another and we consider one another and we figure out what the needs of each other are. That is part of what communion is. That is part of our fellowship together. That is part of what we do. And Paul is saying you are not acting justly and you are not acting rightly. You are not discerning the body of Christ. You are not treating people the way that they need to be treated. And it needs to stop. God says he is completely and totally concerned about justice and righteousness. He will act and he will do what he said he will do. I take a look at our present situation and I wonder, what kind of recourse do we have? What do we do? The other day, my daughter was driving me to her work. She's got a permit. And she actually drove here this Sunday. So if I'm a little bald or a little grayer, you'll understand. Actually, she did a great job. But as we were driving down the road, we saw a young man who was mowing the lawn, and she looked back and said, "Oh, that's so-and-so." And she said, "He probably would have been on your caseload if he had been in school, if he had not moved away." And I said, "Oh, what is that?" She said, "Oh, man," and they were choked up. He was born with a birth defect. He had a cleft palate. And he was made fun of his entire growing up years. Even his own brother made fun of him. Oftentimes, those people who are on my caseload are those who did not have families that were very supportive. That's why they deal with emotional disturbance. But what you had here is a situation with a boy who, in 5th and 6th grade, decided, you know what, I'm going to try to be as nice to people as I possibly could. And they turned on him. Society turned on him and said, "You're weak, you talk funny, you look funny, you're not worth it." He will have to live his entire life with that defect. Oh yeah, it's corrected. He will have to live his entire life with the internal scars that he took upon himself. And we can look at that and we say it's not fair and it's not just. But I am convinced that society, that no country, that no political system can offer that kid the justice and the righteousness he deserves. That justice and the righteousness that he deserves is only found in the context of God's people and God's church. When we take a look at Israel and we see what God did, He formed them together as His people. He created them as His people. And they failed as a nation. And what Jesus did when He came to this earth is He created the church to be the perfect Israel. And it is within the context of the church that true justice and true righteousness must be meted out. We have some very, very wrong concepts about this world if we see it any differently. And I just want to say this, and I don't want it to be inflammatory or anything like that, but Dave White already prayed this in his prayer this morning about how we as a church are supposed to be the church, and we can't rely on the nation, we can't rely on political leaders, and we can't rely on all of this. We have somehow the mistaken idea that this nation was based on Christian principles and that we uphold Christian principles. Do we understand that the founders of this country were not necessarily Christian people? They were more likely deists who believed in some kind of God out there, kind of like a watchmaker God, who had no concern for people at all. When we take a look at our very Declaration of Independence, what does it say? We hold these truths to be self-evident. In other words, what they were saying is, we take a look at ourselves. We take a look inside of ourselves, and we find that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is something that everybody deserves because we have judged it ourselves to be so. In contrast, the church must understand that we do not hold these truths to be self-evident at all. They're not self-evident. They are God-revealed. And that is important. If there is ever to be any kind of equality, if there is ever to be any kind of justice, if there is ever to be any kind of righteousness, then we must understand that it comes solely and totally from God. And we cannot hope to have a society out there. It just is impossible for us to have a society out there that will buy that all wholesale. But it is only those people who are called to be God's people as the church, that must act in justice and righteousness. And so when we see things that are happening out there in the world, it shocks us and it angers us and it makes us sad. But it should not really surprise us as much as it does, because that's how the world works. But we as the church cannot possibly allow it to be here in the church. When there are people who have need, we rise to the occasion as the church. As one person said, the church does not have a social program. The church is a social program. I think that is a little bit of an oversimplification because the church is much more than that. But do we understand what the point was? That we look out for each other, that we watch out for each other, that we have each other's backs, and that when there is injustice going on out there, this is the place where justice is done. That we come together as the people of God, and we exclaim from the rooftops that there is neither slave nor free, Jew nor Gentile, male nor female, but all are one in Christ Jesus. And we are called to be God's people and to act like God's people and to mete out justice and righteousness in this place as the church. I am firmly convinced that when we hold on to that vision, when we do those things, the gates of hell cannot prevail against us. And that will be something that people will see. And they will say, they want that. That is what the dying world is clamoring to have. May we be up to the task of providing it. If you're not in the church, then you don't have this justice, and you don't have this mercy, you don't have this righteousness. You're outside of it. Because when you put yourself to death in the waters of baptism, when you come out a new creature, God adds you to His church. And it is in that context of that church that you have all the blessings that God provides. He calls you into that community. And so if this is the day that you decide that you want to be His child, don't delay. If you're watching out there and you say, I got to do this, give us a call, we'll make it happen. If any of you has that need right now, we'll do it. Come, as we stand aside.